Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. Do you guys remember when Kevin Levrone said this?
If Chris Bumstead went to the open class, where would he place in this year?
I would pick him number one.
What if you had more size on him though?
Doesn't matter, you don't need no more size, in my opinion. Numbers don't lie, right?
Not true.
I mean, the guy's probably the most mainstream bodybuilder that ever existed without even getting into the movies.
Nah, fair enough.
I mean, he looks incredible.
True. Dorian Yates said he wouldn't place top 6 because of his size though, compared to like Hardy and stuff.
Nobody cares about that.
Nah, fair enough.
Look at his following and fan base.
Nah, fair enough.
If the sport was smart, they'd already have a Mr. Olympia.
Even Kevin Levrone likes to glaze Chris like the rest of us. He said that despite size, despite being a classic guy, Chris deserves to win the Olympia in his opinion. And he kinda has a point. Chris Bumstead's physique is so impactful and so pleasing that he has pushed past the limits of bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is a notoriously small niche. And if a physique like that is that well known and that revered even in the most soft core fitness crowds, why is Chris's physique not pushed as the top physique? Not just in classic, but overall in open. That's an interesting thought. But this got me wondering, how would Chris fare in Kevin's mind compared to Kevin himself? Kevin never won the Olympia after all, and he is saying that Chris Bumstead not only could, but should. Maybe someone could go to another expo and try to get this question answered, but I wanted to try to figure it out myself. How would Chris Bumstead do against Kevin Levrone? Now, in order to do this comparison, I wanted to give Chris kind of a handicap. I didn't want to use Kevin's later versions because that just would have been way too much for Chris to handle. Chris's version being used today is obviously from the 2024 Prague Pro, and he did compete in the open division there, but he didn't do an open level off season to pack on the size for that show. So let's compare Chris's open light version compared to Kevin's first ever Olympia appearance from 1992. Kevin actually had one of the best Olympia debuts ever, taking the runner-up spot on his first time out. But he didn't have the size of the later years obviously, and like Kevin said himself, this shouldn't really be a problem for Chris, since Chris has unique gifts that should help him overcome that size discrepancy. After all, if Kevin is saying Chris should be first in today's lineup against 300-pounders like Samson and Andrew, and other stockier guys like Derek and Hadi, a smaller Kevin should be beatable for Chris too by Kevin's own logic. But is that true? Let's find out. Here's 2024 Prague Pro Chris Bumstead versus 1992 Mr. Olympia Kevin Levrone. If you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. Oh boy, this comparison is just such a mess. I really tried my best on sizing these guys, but I'm sure you know how it is with older photos. A lot of these pics are quite literally amateur level photos. This picture of Kevin was actually taken by Milo Sarshev, who was in the audience way up in the front. So you not only have an amateur style photo, but a really harsh angle as well. I tried to size them the best I could. Thankfully, Kevin is a bit taller for a bodybuilder, and he isn't too much shorter than Chris, so the margin to screw this up was fairly narrow. With that disclaimer aside, here we have the front double biceps. This is going to be one of Chris's strongest poses, as the structure plays a key role in the shot. And he does have a slightly better X-frame than Kevin, but it's really all structure. Kevin is winning all of the body parts. The legs are really surprising on Kevin. Very favorable insertions, allowing for impeccable sweep coupled with superb separation. I guess you can give Chris the lats, but I think he looks wider mainly because of his structure. Really, lat mass to lat mass, Kevin is right there with him. And in the arms, I have Kevin simply because if I have an alternative to Chris's shorter biceps, I'm going to take it as long as the peak, overall mass, and conditioning are close. And overall, that does still make this entire pose close. It's like aesthetic bodybuilding versus bodybuilding with aesthetics. Chris brings that shape first and sacrifices mass and thickness, but Kevin has all that great shape with the better, more developed body parts. However, I am not immune to Chris's aura when it comes to this pose. However, we do have to wake up to the fact that this is bodybuilding. There are three main boxes to be checked: structure slash shape, mass slash completeness, and conditioning. Chris is double check marking the structure and shape, but Kevin still has a check mark in that box too. And in terms of separation and overall conditioning, Kevin has a bolder check mark, and that goes for mass completeness as well. Again, Kevin is a bodybuilder with aesthetics, which means he is much better at bodybuilding in this pose while also bringing great shape. I think for that reason, I have to look past Chris on this one, even though that's definitely all who we want to look like more. But of course, that's not what wins shows, at least open bodybuilding shows. And I'd argue that that is the correct take for open bodybuilding. But let's still give Kevin the smallest possible win in this pose. For my system, that's going to be a 1-point win for Kevin out of 3 points possible. The front lat spread is kinda the same. Young Kevin was so solid, really he was throughout his entire career. Here though, the aesthetics are off the charts even compared to his later years. He has a great X-frame and great lats. But I think Chris edges him out here. It's because this is the front lat spread, not the front double biceps. And I think that makes the win a little more objective here. Chris's arms aren't that great, and he definitely got out-muscled in the right places by Kevin. But here, who has the better lats? That's Chris. Kevin still beats him in the quads and through the chest and arms, but Chris does legitimately beat Kevin in the lats, which is the most important thing. Once again, Kevin does look more like a bodybuilder with aesthetics, while Chris is more of an aesthetic bodybuilder. But this time he has the namesake of the pose in his column. He's not just trying to play the structure card, he's playing the structure card and the key element. With all that Kevin does though, again, he is technically the better bodybuilder, I won't be giving Chris anything more than 1 point. We're moving on from the structure-focused poses now to our first side pose, the side chest. Both of these guys are on the short list for some of the best side chest poses ever. And even though it's not really a structure pose, Chris's structure still pulls a ton of weight. It's the main reason why he's so good. Yes, the pecs are fantastic, but having a huge frame with a huge Arnold-like ribcage underneath Arnold-like pecs really props Chris up here, literally and metaphorically. However, Kevin doesn't give a shit about that. He has an even better pose, and honestly, it is slightly because of his structure too. Being tall is cool, but for this pose, he's tall enough, but being more compact helps the mass just look bigger. Assuming similar body fat percentage, if you have two guys that weigh 200 pounds, who looks like the bigger dude? One that's 6 foot or a short king at 5'7"? Kevin probably weighs less than Chris here, or maybe about the same, but he's a bit more compact and really full. That was Kevin's calling card. He was always so 3D and so round in those arms, delts, and the chest. And that's what this pose is all about. He has a ton of detail in all these muscle groups as well. This combo of extreme fullness and fresh looking muscle and the details give him the win in the arm, the delt, and the pecs too, although this is definitely closer than the other two things. And he also takes some other wins in the midsection and the side leg. He's either bigger / fuller and or more detail in all these areas compared to Chris, except the pecs where it's fairly close. But after looking at these first three poses, Kevin takes the strongest win so far in this pose. It's a bodybuilder pose and he fulfills that quota. Oh, and by the way, this picture isn't even from the 92 Olympia. This is actually from the 92 Night of Champions. So he probably actually looked a couple percent better at the Olympia. Overall, with that little handicap and everything in the actual pose, I think I can put this one at 2 points for Kevin. They both really do have fantastic poses, so this feels wrong to do to Chris, but realistically, I wouldn't be picking him very many times out of 100, so I think Kevin just barely scratches the surface at 2 points. Chris continues to apply pressure in the back shots though. Kevin has a great back for a top level amateur in this pose, which he was just a few months prior to the showing. And Chris is really not too much further along on the spectrum in the grand scheme of things, but when you compare these two, there is a big disparity. Kevin has that good detail, but his back is paper thin. His arms and delts and even the lower body is much better than the back itself, and those things just aren't pulling enough weight. But I would give them to Kevin. He has the better biceps and triceps, the more detailed delts, so he wins the upper limbs. I'd even give Kevin the lower limbs. He has pretty good hams and tighter glutes. I know his entire thighs look a bit smaller, but that's just the way they posed back then before Dorian's reign really set in. Dorian was doing the same thing back in 92 actually. But back to the back, Chris is just too thick. Kevin just can't win with that flimsy back, even if he does have good detail. And since I gave Kevin the side chest with 2 points, I'm giving this one to Chris with 2 points. Basically, I'm adjusting my system and expectations to fit these two physiques. It may seem like a small difference, but really between these two, this is as big as the differences we're going to get. And I do feel that the side chest for Kevin and the rear double for Chris were won by roughly the same margin. So 2 points to Chris here. For some reason, Kevin actually gains ground in what should be his weaker back pose. Chris has the structure on Kevin, which should lead to some smooth sailing for him in the rear lat spread, but Kevin actually steps his game up here. Kevin has the lower body on Chris once again because of the detail, and now Kevin is the thicker one on the back. Chris may have fuller lats, but Kevin has those really thick erectors and traps. And in terms of width, is Chris really that much wider? He probably is given his structure, but this is where sizing is really important, and we all know how that went for me. I would say here Kevin is probably a little bit smaller than he would be in real life. But even in these pics, he's barely behind Chris in terms of width. Overall, I think width is pretty much a 50-50, but I'm giving Chris the slight edge and the entire pose as well. Width is the deciding factor here, and that barely gets Chris over the finish line to me because he also has the thicker lats and a good lower body. I can definitely turn right around though and say Kevin is more detailed overall, including in the back, and really isn't that much narrower. Again, pretty close to 50-50, but the width does it for Chris. Now we have another side pose, our last side pose now, but this is a little different from the side chest. There's a little more emphasis always placed on shape in the side tri than in the side chest. But once again, in terms of those bodybuilding things, Kevin is pretty good, and young Kevin doesn't need any help in the shape department either. Unfortunately, this isn't the most fair comparison to Chris though, and even Kevin. There is a photo shoot pic of Kevin on the left, and that is from the 1992 Olympia, but the pic on the right is from the 1992 Chicago Pro. But these were the best photos, so we have to roll with it. This makes it hard to get a truly fair and accurate comparison, but I think with most things, we can give Kevin the edge. In the side leg and the left photos, the shadows aren't favorable, but if you look at the right photo, you can see that his cuts are about the same depth-wise as Chris's. Then in the midsection, this is definitely the biggest difference. Kevin wins here. They're both solid, they keep it tight and have good abs, but the execution really undermines Chris here. There's no reason to lean that far forward and hide the waist, because unlike a lot of other open guys, Chris's midsection is actually good and should be shown off wherever possible. With Kevin being more upright, it just makes him look more correct. So you have to go with him. In the pecs, these guys are also very similar, but I'd probably give Kevin the slight nod as I think he has just a touch more fullness and Chris's posture once again sells him short. Then in the arm, Chris is very solid, great delt mass, great detail and a thick horseshoe. His triceps are definitely heaps better than his biceps, but I see Kevin as an upgrade in all these things, especially when you include the photo shoot pic, which is the main thing we are comparing. His tricep is just a bit longer inserting and he still carries the same mass, and the delt also has great mass and detail. So pretty much in every area, Kevin is a little bit better. That includes how he hits the pose itself, which pulls a lot more weight than any of his wins of the body parts actually. He looks just plain better and more composed in this one, and you can tell Chris never really had the practice to hit this one throughout his career. He brings good elements like a good side leg, tricep, and a small waist. Kevin upgrades that though, so he takes this pose with 1 point. Now in the abs and thighs, I couldn't find a single picture of Kevin hitting the pose properly from a head-on angle. He did do it, but the angles and the photo quality of him hitting that variation of the pose is just garbage. So what you see here was probably the best option for him. To further complicate the matter, Chris isn't even actually that good in the crunched abs and thighs pose. The vacuum is legendary, but that's basically only extra credit in an open comparison. And it can only be extra credit after the actual assignment of the crunched abs and thighs pose is properly hit first. So basically from what I can tell, this is a very close pose, which is obviously very frustrating because we can't tell from the pics. We can use some context clues though. Would Kevin beat Chris in the legs? Probably. He has been doing so in every pose thus far. And in the abs, we can kind of see here that Kevin's were a little more deeply edged compared to Chris's. Kevin would probably beat Chris in the crunched abs and thighs variation. However, it wouldn't be by a resounding margin. But with that, we have to now consider Chris's vacuum. It's already very close. It's close enough that when you do factor in Chris's vacuum, some people are probably going to say that tips the balances just enough to make him the winner of the pose. I don't necessarily want to get crucified today, so that is what I'm going to do. Kevin barely won on the crunched abs to crunched abs, but when you include the vacuum again as extra credit, I think Chris does narrowly edge Kevin out for a 1-point win. And finally, we have the last pose of the comparison, the most muscular. This is a pose Kevin dominates. From the start of his career up until the end, there weren't very many people that were able to beat him. And a prime Kevin Levrone in the mid-90s had one of the best most musculars of all time. And it's clear that he always had the things that make the pose great. And he just kept expanding on them as his career went on. The reasons that Kevin is so dominant here has to do with the amount of muscle he has and the quality of that muscle. He really is just bigger than Chris in everything from quads to delts. Chris's structure helps mitigate his loss in muscularity a little bit, but also at the same time it arguably hurts. He has this huge structure which isn't properly filled out for open, so he looks kind of lanky next to Kevin. And look at all those details present in Kevin's physique. And this is with some bad photo quality too. His legs are more separated, the chest and delts have all these striations throughout them, and Kevin's midsection is actually a lot better than Chris's here because of detail. With Kevin winning every body part on size and detail, and the overall muscularity component since he's more muscular per pound, this is by far the closest we've ever come to a 3-point win in this comparison. I wasn't going to do it at first, to be honest. I was going to give Chris a reprieve because of his structure, but then I remembered what I said about considering the playing field. These guys are so close, a win like this is actually resounding because it doesn't get more resounding than this. So adjusted for the rest of the matchup, Kevin is going to conclude this comparison with a 3-point win in the most muscular. We're now on to the second round of judging the overall physique categories. Here we're taking a look at 4 categories: muscularity, shape, conditioning, and flaws. We're actually going to start by tossing the flaws category out completely. Outside of things that fit into other categories, these guys really don't have flaws. They don't have sus, SEOU, Skyno, and by modern standards, these guys are pretty much perfect. At least free of major blemishes. Anything I could nitpick really shouldn't be counted, so we'll just leave this one blank. Now, as I've said time and time again, these guys are pretty similar after flaws. The next 3 categories are all going to be 1-pointers in fact. First up, we're going to give Chris shape. I know some people are going to say, nah, this should be 2 or 3 points for Chris. He's just so classic. He's the epitome of shape. Well, that's cool. I didn't ask. Look at Kevin's routine right now and tell me this isn't some of the best shape you've ever seen in the modern era of bodybuilding. Yes, Chris's structure is a bit bigger and his proportions are a little bit more exaggerated, so he'll get the nod. But Kevin was a work of art this year. Don't get it twisted. But after that, in conditioning and muscularity, the bodybuilding things, Kevin takes both. Chris really came in full at the Prague Pro. It didn't have the crispiest or driest physique, and Kevin did. He was saran wrapped. And I kept bringing up the details in the legs, chest, even the midsection time and time again. And every time I'd be giving them to Kevin. And just go back and look at the lower bodies from the rear if you're still unsure. Kevin has the sharper glutes and hams. And I don't think I need to tell you about muscularity. Now, Kevin doesn't win here by more than 1 point for 2 reasons. The rear double left a pretty poor taste in my mouth. That was a serious gap in Kevin's physique. And Chris's structure would probably help him out a lot on a real stage. And honestly, with my sizing being so poor, I don't want to jump to any drastic conclusions. It is safe to say Kevin wins here though. I'm pretty confident in a 1-point win. He was more muscular pound for pound than Chris after all, and he was more developed in most body parts. That was definitely an interesting comparison, but now it's time to reveal the final scores. I don't know what you guys think, but I had my winner before, during, and after I did this comparison and saw the results. And it turns out I was leaning the right way. And I imagine most of us thought the same thing, so you were probably right too. Winning this comparison with 61.2 points was Kevin Levrone's Olympia debut version, with Chris's open debut version clocking in at 38.8 points. So yes, I thought Kevin was going to win before I put this one together, but I really liked this matchup, so I wanted to do it anyway. What I didn't expect though was how close this was. They were actually split on poses 4-4, and there were only 3 points to go around in the overall physique categories. So while there is a 20-point difference in the final scores, it was actually much closer on paper. However, I have to really address a gripe I have with doing comparisons with Chris Bumstead's open version. When doing comparisons with Chris, you have to go into them knowing that he is a former classic competitor, and he pretty much just did open on a whim. So knowing those things, he kind of gets a pass for missing all this muscle of a regular open guy. You have to kind of ignore the fact that he's basically just a really full classic physique competitor in order to even believe some of these matchups. The prerequisite of any bodybuilding contest is size. That is the cornerstone of bodybuilding. It's why I don't compare guys from the 70s to the 90s, or many amateurs to top pros. There's just no point. Chris gets a pass though, and really it's not just exactly for his name and legacy. He does have a big structure, great shape, and condition. There are legitimate good things about him even in an open lineup, but come on a real stage, is Chris beating Kevin? I really don't think so. These guys are on 2 different tiers in terms of muscular development. So at the same time, if you ignore Chris's lack of size, then sure, he gets close to Kevin, but we have to ignore the literal cornerstone of bodybuilding for that to happen. Imagine if Chris wasn't Chris in this comparison and didn't get the luxury of us forgetting that he's missing about 25 pounds of muscle. I wouldn't have even done the comparison. He wouldn't have even placed second at the Prague Pro more than likely. Now, I'm not upset with doing comparisons with Chris, but it is important to note that his opponents aren't playing the Chris game. He's actually playing theirs. And Kevin wins this game. It goes back to what I said earlier. We had an aesthetic bodybuilder and a bodybuilder with aesthetics. Kevin was more conditioned, more complete, and just bigger while having some of the best shape at the 90s. The lack of a good rear double pose does jeopardize his lead slightly, but with some strong side poses and keeping it close or winning some of the front shots, he was able to beat Chris fairly comfortably in my opinion. Kevin had great things to say about Chris, as you'll recall from the beginning of the video, but I do think Kevin is thinking a little idealistically. He wants bodybuilding to be uprooted entirely, and he wants to change the current game to Chris's game. I think there's plenty of debate to be had there. Maybe we should just make classic the flagship division of bodybuilding instead of open. That seems to be what the people want to see. But right now, that's dumb. There are so many guys that bring aesthetics on top of massive conditioning. We're in a whole new era now with the win of Samson Dauda. So while I get where Kevin is coming from, I think he's overselling Chris a little bit. Chris is honestly lucky that he and Kevin don't have to go head to head for a Sandow in some kind of Twilight Zone. Chris Bumstead may have the structure and the classic appeal, but again, he loses the game of bodybuilding. And Kevin was more muscular, more complete, and more conditioned. So while we all look at Chris in awe of that structure, when you get down to it, someone like 1992 Kevin would beat him. And that's exactly what happened today. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. What did you guys think of this one? Do you think Kevin pretty much wins by default, or do you think he legitimately could be pushed by Chris? Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you guys like these types of videos, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more just like it. And if you want to support the channel even further and want to get your hands on some high quality supplements, head over to Arms Race Nutrition. Then at checkout, use my code Project10 for 10% off your entire order. That's code Project10, armsracenutrition.com. And finally, with all that said, I'm going to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.
Go so far, oh, I'm gonna have my name in that Lexi, yeah. Gotta get that Lexi, yeah.